Thank you so much. All right, oh, continue. Make sure, I think everyone's got to click continue too. All right, so folks, here's the deal. Right now, the metric system is the system of measurement. So here in the US, we use things like miles, we use things like inches, we use things like feet. The majority of the world uses the metric system. Okay, they don't say that from here to there is 15 miles. They're going to talk about it in kilometers. So the first thing that we have to know is there are, for our purposes, there's a lot of different units of measurement, but for our purposes right now, when you first learn this and you first do conversions, we're going to use the meter. Now, those of you in science class or math class, that big meter stick, okay? So there was that big stick that you usually measured from in science classes. That's 1 meter. That big thing, it's usually up to about your waist. At least it was for me. But the big meter stick, that one stick from the beginning to the end is 1 meter. Okay. Now, in that 1 meter, okay, there are, if you look closely at it, it's labeled actually in centimeters. So there are actually 100 centimeters in that 1 meter, and I'm going to write it. The abbreviation, you know, is cm. I think you guys already knew that, is for centimeters. Now, if you look closely at the 100 centimeters, if you look, there's little tiny little lines between the centimeters, and actually those are millimeters. And if you look from the beginning of the meter stick to the end of the meter stick, there's actually 1,000 millimeters. I feel like there's 2 L's. There are. Are there 2 L's? Now I'm see that looks right.
You're right. That is, I believe right.
For some reason that looked weird to me.
So again, guys, 100 centimeters and a meter.
And then last, we're going to talk about a kilometer. Now, kilometer, remember, is how you measure those really long runs. So a kilometer is way bigger than all of these. And the one thing that you have to know is that a kilometer, so there's 100 centimeters in 1 meter, there's 1,000 millimeters in 1 meter, but there are actually 1,000 meters in 1 kilometer. And we use km as a kilometer. So there's 1,000 of those little meter sticks. Not little. There's 1,000 of those meter sticks in 1 kilometer. So when you run in the turkey trot, when they measure out 5 kilometers, they're actually measuring out 5,000 of these, because 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000 will get you the 5 kilometers. Okay. So if you have this written down, we're going to talk about how you make conversions, okay? But this list is going to be what you're going to be using. Now I'm at the 5-minute mark. I'm only going to talk for about 5 minutes more, and then you guys are going to get a chance to practice some and then do a bigger assignment that we're going to actually look at and give you feedback on whether you know it, okay? So hopefully you have this written down. I'm going to give you another couple seconds to make sure it's written down. Remember, Dr. Oliver is putting it in the chat. And again, I'm sorry for the hat. I really thought that this class started at 10:15. Totally my mistake.
No hats in school.
Oh, but we're not in school. Boom, served ya. All right, maybe that wasn't as big of a serve as I thought, was it? Nah, probably not. All right, so here's the deal. You have to make conversions between these units of measurements. So all you're going to have to do is we're going to make you're like, well, what does this have to do with what we're learning? It's because you're going to make a scale. So let me show you, okay? Now you have this written down. I have this in my memory. So I'm going to erase this for a second, but you're going to use this every single time. All right, so let's say we say to you 2.5 meters equals blank centimeters. Okay, so what you're going to have to do. So you know what? You write this down. We'll do a couple together, and then we're going to give you some on your own to do. Okay. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to, what is the scale between meters and centimeters? So we're going to have to go back to that chart you just did, and I'm going to write down 1 meter is the same as 100 centimeters. Remember, that was true. And every time you have 1 meter, you have 100 centimeters. Now, the reason we're writing this is because, and when you get good at this, sometimes you don't have to write the scale, but especially in the beginning, I want you to write this down. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw those 2 arrows we did just like with maps. Well, if you have a meter and you're going this way, what do you multiply by? Well, how do you go from 1 to 100? You multiply by 100. Now that lets us know is if we have a meter and we want to know how many centimeters, we multiply by 100. Well, if you're going backwards, you're going from 100 to 1. What's the opposite of times 100? Now, those of you who are getting really good, and I bet you if I asked you, what are you multiplying by? You would say that you're multiplying by 1 over 100. That's the opposite of times 100. It's times 1 over 100. But you also, hopefully you're starting to remember that times 1 over 100 is just a fancy way to say dividing by 100. Okay? Now, here's the cool thing. Once you do this, it's actually really easy to convert. So in this problem, we have the meters and we're going to centimeters. So I look down at my chart and I say, okay, if I have the meters and I'm going this way, what do I do? And you can see that you multiply by 100. So if you want to know how many centimeters are in this many meters, we're going to multiply by 100. Now, if you use a calculator, you do 2.5 times 100. But one thing you're going to start noticing is when you multiply by 100, all you're really doing is moving the decimal over twice because there's 2 zeros. And when you move the decimal over twice, you actually get 250. And that is how many centimeters are in 2.5 meters, which actually makes sense because if you have 2.5 meter sticks, you have 100, then you have another 100, and then you have half of 100, which is 50. But this is how you do. Let me show you one more, and then we're going to start giving you practice. And we're not expecting everyone to be an expert right away. We want you to make mistakes, and hopefully by the end of class, you're going to be experts. So I'm erasing everything. You do the same. And again, just practice with me. Now, let's say there are 200 millimeters, and we want to know how many meters. All right. And then it's going to get, after this one, we're going to do one harder one because there is one that sometimes is very, very difficult to do, okay? All right, so we're going to make our little chart first. Remember, we have millimeters and meters. So I'm going to go back to that chart and say, okay, what's the relationship between meters and millimeters? So we talked about this before, that in 1 meter, there's 1,000 millimeters. Okay, so we're going to do our little chart of with the arrow. So if we're going from meters to millimeters, what do you multiply by? Well, it goes from 1 to 1,000, so we're multiplying by 1,000. And if we're going backwards, we're multiplying by 1 over 1,000, which remember is a fancy way to say dividing by 1,000. I could even write that if you want. Dividing by 1,000. Okay, so now we look back up and we say, okay, we have the millimeters, but we're going to meters. So, okay, so I have to start here and we're going this way. Well, this is the arrow we're going to be using. So I have 1,000 and I'm going this way. Okay, so that means that in order to go from millimeters to meters, I'm going to have to divide by 1,000. So on your calculator, you do this one of 2 ways. You could take 200, you type in the number 200, and I'll show you that. So I have the number 200, and I'm going to hit divided by, and I'm going to hit 1,000. And I get an answer of 0.2, and that's your answer. If there were 200 millimeters, there are 0.2 meters, which makes sense because a meter is much, you would have to have 1,000 millimeters. Sorry, guys, I'm making this little. You would have to have 1,000 millimeters to have 1 meter. So this is less than 1,000, so this is going to be less than 1. Now, the other thing you're going to notice, for those of you that really want to get fancy, is when you divide by 1,000, instead of going to the decimal going to the right, the decimal actually goes to the left. And because there's 3 zeros, you're going to go back 3 times. Watch this. 1, 2, 3. So you actually don't even need a calculator. You could just move the decimal back 3 times and get 0.2. You don't need all the zeros at the end of it. Right? Now, let's give you guys 2 practices, and then we're going to do one more hard one, and then we'll go from there, okay? So,
Wait,
what'd you say?
really quick, how did you know to move 3 back?
Oh, it's when you're dividing by 1,000, when you're dividing by 10, 100, 1,000, there's a trick. You can just move the decimal back. If you're dividing, you're making it smaller, and you're doing it by how many zeros there are. So if we were dividing by 100, there are 2 zeros, we would move it back twice. If we're dividing by 1,000, you're moving back 1,000. Now, if that doesn't make sense, because some of you might not want to use the trick, even though it is a nice shortcut, you could always just use your calculator and just divide, okay? But you're going to start noticing that when you divide, the decimal moves to the left. When you multiply, the decimal moves to the right. Okay. All right. So here's what we want. Folks, can everyone right now, I hope this doesn't backfire with the screen, but can everyone go ahead and even if you don't have a whiteboard, can you put yourself on video? We're going to go ahead and again, folks, no offense, and I'm not mad at you, but some of you, if you don't try, you automatically get a 0 for this. So again, we're okay. It's okay if you get this wrong, but go ahead and put yourself on video. We're going to put one problem on. Try to use your whiteboard to show your work. I want to see all the work. Don't just put an answer. Okay. So can everyone write this problem down for us, please? All right. And then can everyone go ahead and make their chart first? Okay. You need the relationship between meters and kilometers. Okay. All right. Go ahead. Michael, Maya, you talked to me. Michael, you're not on video, bud, and you're getting a 0 for this. So please, again, it's okay if you aren't on video, but you have to make sure you get credit for this because I mean, no offense, I like you all, and it'd be awesome if you all got A's and B's. All right. So as soon